Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, December 10th, 2025. We are in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 26. We're dealing with King Uzziah. Let's start in verse 1. Then all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in place of his father Amaziah. He was the one who rebuilt Elath and restored it to Judah after Amaziah rested with his fathers. This is essentially word for word exactly the same as 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 21 through 22. After Amaziah died, they took the oldest son and they made him king. He's 16. He's not really experienced. He's not really knowledgeable. He's not really a good person to be king, but he's the best they have. So they hope he'll do well. He had also had some experience in that he had commanded people who took this city from the northern kingdom, Elath, and rebuilt it and made it a Judean city. So he had some military experience. He had some civil town building experience and was therefore a good choice. At 16, you can't expect him to be mature, but he's better than his father was, who worshipped foreign gods that he captured in battle. So, as we continue to read, you're going to find out more about him, and he's actually a pretty good king in many ways. Verse 3. Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. His mother's name was Jechaliah. She was from Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. He sought God during the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of the Lord. As long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. So there is the good summary of what his reign was like but we'll get to until in a minute. As long as he had good advisors that advised him correctly and instructed him, and he was young enough man that he paid attention to his advisors, he actually did well. And the people liked him and enjoyed him, and they remembered him well. And verses 3 and 4 there are a summary of what's in 1 Kings 15, verses 1 through 3. A little tighter writing here, but the essential information's there, both places. 1 Kings chapter 15 deals with him in about 7 verses. We're going to read a whole lot more than that about Uzziah here. They call him Uzziah here in 2 Chronicles. They had another name in 1 Kings. They both refer to the same person. And we're going to find a whole lot more information here because it's the end of the chapter before we get back to the 2 Kings account from actually verse 5 on till we get to the end of the chapter is new material that apparently came from the Royal Chronicles, and we're going to get to at the end of the chapter where some of it was. We've studied him studying a different book, and that's where we get a lot of information about him, but a lot of this information isn't even there. So this is new material to Scripture, so they had a different source. Verse 6. He went to war against the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod. He then rebuilt towns near Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabs who lived in Gur-Baal and against the Meunites. The Ammonites brought tribute to Uzziah, and his fame spread as far as the border of Egypt because he had become very powerful. So he had great foreign influence, and he attacked one of the greatest, longest lasting enemies that the kingdom of Judah had, and was very successful. Took down 3 of their big cities, 2 of their capital cities, and one of their strong economic hubs, and broke down the wall and built towns within their territory, which means he was moving Jews into Philistine territory and taking it over. Sound familiar? It's still going on today. It was a tactic they'd been using since Joshua. As the population expanded, they would move into somebody else's territory, kill off the locals, take up residence. It's what they'd been doing since they invaded the land under Joshua. He is one of the few kings to successfully do it since David. And 2 Chronicles leaves the impression that he was successful because God gave him success because he was faithful to God. He's at least publicly faithful to God. Now, we found that the last 2 chapters, the priesthood had become corrupted and they were not doing things correctly. In 2 Kings, it said he was faithful to God, but the people still offered sacrifices on the high places and under every green tree, and he never stopped those practices, and they still worship foreign gods out in the countryside. So, he was publicly faithful to God, but he was not one to convince the people to be faithful to God. They were doing whatever they wanted to do elsewhere. And we're going to find out a few verses later, he wasn't all that faithful to God either. But God gave him success in war. And he defeated strong enemies. He defeated people that needed to be beat back to keep the country safe. And the Ammonites, who a generation before had been defeating Judah, were now bringing him tribute. They didn't want him invading their land. It was cheaper to buy him off than to deal with him militarily. And his fame spread all the way to Egypt. Now you'd think, that's not very far. That's just across the Sinai. Yeah. Egypt was a weak country at that time, a weak kingdom. But they were holding their own. They could hold their own border. There was nobody really powerful to attack them. The Philistines were the most powerful thing north of them. The Arabs were basically raiders that came in, grabbed, and ran. And if you saw the raiders coming in, you grabbed your wife and kids and ran. They weren't interested in killing anybody. They wanted to grab your grain and head off quickly. They wanted to grab your clothes and head off quickly. Wanted to grab your gold and head off quickly. And to the Egyptians, they were an annoyance, but not a serious threat. So that he was famous all the way to Egypt meant everybody that dealt with him feared him. And the Egyptians respected him, but didn't concern themselves with him because he was fighting the same people they were fighting. And therefore they could make an ally of him, but not have to deal with him. Verse 9. Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate and at the valley gate and at the angle of the wall, and he fortified them. He also built towers in the desert and dug many cisterns, because he had much livestock in the foothills and in the plain. He had people working his fields and vineyards in the hills and in the fertile lands, for he loved the soil. So he built good defenses there in Jerusalem and out in the countryside. And because rain was not necessarily dependable, and he loved the land, he loved agricultural produce, he loved animals, he built cisterns so that he could store the rainwater when it came, and they would have drinking water. It wouldn't all just run off. This also had the benefit of it soaked in the ground and made the water last longer, so the greenery grew more and made the ground more lush. And they could water their fields, their vineyards, their olive trees, their pomegranate trees, their palm trees more, and grow more. And he had this building mentality of building the infrastructure that it takes to make the country prosperous. And the people loved him and appreciated him. Yes, in one sense, he has come to own the whole countryside. He's that kind of dictator. On the other hand, he's making the economy prosperous and the people that work for him prosperous, and so they don't mind too much. They've seen under the previous kings them being despots and not making the country prosper, just making themselves wealthy. And here he is making the country wealthy so that he can be more wealthy by owning it all and making the countryside better. And the people under him own more, or tend more livestock, tend more grain, tend more fruit trees, tend more animals. They make more agricultural produce, and they're servants of the king, so they're paid for it, and because he's built up the infrastructure, they can do more and therefore be paid more. So it's a win-win for everybody. And it's because he loved agricultural produce. So he became famous and he became powerful. People were willing to work for him. People were willing to fight for him. And the people remembered him fondly. And as long as he lived, he was remembered with fondness. Even though he did evil things, he was good for the country, good for the people. Verse 11. Uzziah had a well-trained army ready to go out by divisions according to their numbers, as mustered by Jeiel the secretary and Maaseiah the officer under the direction of Hananiah, one of the royal officials. The total number of family leaders over the fighting men was 2,600, excuse me. Under their command was an army of 3,700, excuse me, I'm reading numbers wrong tonight. 307,500 men trained for war, a powerful force to support the king against his enemies. Now, this is a much smaller army than a lot of the previous kings have had, but this is a professional standing army that trains all the time. Most of the former armies were draftable armies. Every man had his own land. They would train some period of time. When the country went to war, they would grab their gear and go and spend a few days renewing their training, and then would go to war. And they depended upon their lands to support them, to help them pay for their armor and their weapons, and keep them strong and healthy, and then, shape up their fighting skills for a little bit before they headed to war, and sharpen their battle skills on the battlefield. It made for a great civilian army, but not necessarily well-coordinated fighting. Even if every warrior was good at fighting, they didn't fight as units. They didn't trust each other. They didn't back each other up. Some of the things that are, the core fundamentals of a modern army. On the other hand, Uzziah built that into his army, and this was a standing army that practiced basically all the time. He supplied them with weapons and armor, as we'll read in the next few verses, and fed them, clothed them, housed them. They were at his beck and call all the time, and they prepared for it, and they had the pride of being a full-time practice military, and so therefore they could face much larger armies that weren't so well disciplined and win. That's why he defeated the Philistines. That's why he defeated the Arabs, who were, basically hit and run raiders, what we'd call today terrorists. They weren't an effective fighting force. Here's this professional army that went out and, could wipe them out easily because they were trained and, didn't have losses basically against that kind of fighting force. If somebody accidentally got struck, they might get wounded. If the enemy was really lucky, they might kill man. But Uzziah had an army that, felt invincible, and they knew it, and they were trained, and they protected each other, and they had each other's back, and they fought as a unit. He had one of the first armies in the world that did that. The Egyptians had at several points in their history had that kind of army, but at this point in time, they didn't have a standing army anymore. If Uzziah had a different mindset, he might have built an empire. But with only 300,000 fighting men, he really didn't have all that big of an army, even though it was a very professional army. Verse 14. Uzziah provided shields, spears, helmets, coats of armor, bows, and sling stones for the entire army. In Jerusalem, he made machines designed by skillful men for use on the towers and on the corner defenses to shoot arrows and hurl large stones. His frame spread far and wide, for he was greatly helped until he became powerful. So he had men under his command that engineered war machines that shot arrows in large numbers automatically from the walls of Jerusalem and hurled stones. Apparently, his men were the inventors of the onager and other wall defenses. Uh, the I've forgotten the name of the equipment that shoots arrows, but an arrow shot by a bow in the hand of a man from a top of a wall down to somebody down below is a quite devastating thing. But when you shoot whole buckets of arrows all at once by a bigger bow that shoots faster and more powerfully than a hand-drawn bow, that, a team of men pulls back and it can shoot, dozens to hundreds to thousands of arrows at once, even if the reload rate is a little slower than a hand shot arrow. A hand shot arrow, 6 to 12 arrows a minute is top rate. If you're going to aim, 6 is about the maximum you can shoot. Here, the war machines, you didn't aim them. You meant to mow down large numbers of men that were on the ground by just mass firing. And he had the industrial capability to stockpile, hundreds of thousands or billions of arrows to be used in these machines, making the area around Jerusalem just a killing field. You couldn't camp within marching distance of the walls, because if you camped at night, he could fire at night and your army would be dead in their sleep. You pull up, war machines to besiege the walls, he could throw rocks at them and devastate them, or throw rocks through the mounted cavalry that might be able to get from outside the arrow range up to the wall quickly. So he had a well-defended city. The people could flee to Jerusalem if somebody invaded, and he could defend it well. And the invading armies knew that. He had a technological superiority at Jerusalem. Invading Jerusalem was suicide, and that was known. And so he became very powerful politically and very powerful militarily, and the people loved him. And because he was a man of the soil and enjoyed the soil and growing things, he could feed that standing army. And everybody was well fed and well armed, and he could pay his armors and the people who made the weapons and feed everybody, and everybody was happy with that arrangement. And so he was very greatly helped until he became powerful. That's a key statement there. Let's go to verse 16 to understand it. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest, with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord, followed him in. They confronted him and said, "It is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God." So the priests did their job. They confronted him. He entered the temple where he wasn't supposed to be. he was doing the priest's job instead of letting the priest do it. If he had been content to pay them and order them to do it and ordered them to do the job right, God would have continued to bless him. But he took on the pride of, I'm going to be king and priest, and he went in to offer incense, and they confronted him. And they confronted him in the temple and warned him that God would harm him because he did. That God would not honor what he did. Verse 19. Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand ready to burn incense, became angry. While he was raging at the priest in their presence before the incense altar at the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. So he's the tyrant, and he has this attitude that whatever he says goes, and he gets mad at the priest, and as he's raging at this mob of priests, which is 81 priests within that part of the temple, it's basically wall-to-wall priest. He's not going anywhere, and no supporters are coming in after him to help him. And God strikes him with leprosy while he's ranting and raving at them. So God has struck him because leprosy does not form instantly. It's not something that normal course of things. This is a miracle leprosy. It's like Moses' hand when he was performing the miracles for Pharaoh. Would stick it in his robe. It'd be whole as it brought in, and as it brought it out, it'd be leprous. And then Moses would stick his hand back in, and it would be totally healed, and his hand would be normal again. Excuse me. That's that kind of same breakout of leprosy. But this wasn't God showing his power and then going to heal Uzziah. This was God's judgment on Uzziah because he had usurped the place of the priest, and he had not stayed in his lane. He should have stayed as king and warrior and enabler of the people and ruler, and he would have prospered for his 52 years of reign. Because he didn't, he ended up with leprosy. Verse 20. When Azariah, the chief priest, and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. When the other priests saw him, they know he went in without leprosy, or they'd been confronting him and telling him he was unclean. He couldn't enter the temple. Now they see the leprosy. They pronounce him unclean and tell him he has to leave because he's leprous in the temple. And when he realizes that he's leprous, he wants to leave the temple too. He realizes, oh wait, God might kill me. Indeed, if he'd continued to try to be a priest, I think God would have. But because he left when the priest said, oh, you're leprous now, and, hurried him out. And the priests were so concerned about the sanctity of the temple and keeping it pure, they were willing to help him out and touch him and become unclean by having touched a leprous person. And everybody present knew it was God afflicting him because he had acted like a priest. And so his pride led to his downfall by going in and acting as a priest, and God striking him with leprosy, and he left the temple. Verse 21, King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous and excluded from the temple of the Lord. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. So, because he was leprous, they excluded him from contact with others. They built him basically a separate house, and he lived in it, and he had no contact with anybody else the rest of his days. He lived a long time in that house. 2 Kings 15 deals with the timeline a little bit better than Chronicles does. But it was limited on details. It just simply said Uzziah was struck with leprosy, and he lived in a separate house, and his son Jotham ruled in his place, and left it at that. It didn't tell why God struck him. The writers of 2 Kings were writing soon after the events, and Uzziah was still popular, and he had people around. It may have been even written while he was still alive, and they didn't want to offend him. They didn't want to offend his supporters. They didn't want to tell all the truth. They didn't say whether he was a good king or bad king, whether he was popular or not. They just said he was, powerful, and then God struck him with leprosy, and he lived in a separate house. And they said that he was buried in a tomb for a leper because they didn't want to put him in with kings. They didn't want to bury him with his fathers. And so they buried him in a new tomb separate that was reserved for leprous people because he was a leper. Here it flat says why he was struck with leprosy and that why he lived separately, and that Jotham was regent as long as he lived. Now, 2 Kings basically has Jotham being king from the day he became regent. And the difference in the Hebrew language, there's no difference in the wording in the Hebrew language. Here in 2 Chronicles, they have met other cultures. They're living in Babylon, and the Babylonians had a king. They very often had a prime minister, or more than one prime minister. They could have a king that was a warrior and then a king that was a regent. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, he was actually not all that good of an administrator. He was a great warrior. He spent most of his life out on the battlefield as king, and he had people ruling in his place and running the country. And when he ran back to Babylon, he would sit on the throne, and the regents would report to him, and he basically would tell them, hey, yeah, good job. Let's build the army back up and go to war again. And y'all run things while I'm gone. And they would, yay, let's build the army up and get you out of town. Because he wasn't all that good an administrator, and they ran the show better than he did. And his son was one of those regents. And so when Nebuchadnezzar died, his son was regent, but he wasn't a warrior, so he didn't spend much time on the battlefield. He was running an empire that his dad had built. So these people writing this recognize that, and they say Jotham is the regent. It's a new word in Hebrew. 2 Kings, basically the word that we translate as king is he's leader. And they didn't distinguish between you're a leader under your father and you're a leader independently of your father after he died. Jotham was the leader. Here they distinguish that Jotham was ruling for his father while Uzziah was in the leper's house. 2 Kings, and particularly the book of Isaiah, indicate that Uzziah still did some statecraft. There would be a servant that would go in and out and pass messages, bring him food, bring him supplies, bring messages out, but whose job was to be the interface between Uzziah and the rest of the world. But that person would be considered unclean all the time, but wouldn't live with him in this separate house, would live in a separate little house in the compound, and then people would consult with him, and if he became leprous, then he would have to go live somewhere else, and somebody else would get to be that servant. I'm sure that was an honored position, high risk, didn't touch the king. And the countryside just got used to, we have two kings, one that can't rule and is living in a house because he has leprosy, and one that actually does the job. Except Uzziah probably was still doing administrative things, handling documents, writing documents, things like that, and they would be passed out and messages passed around. That's what the impression that Isaiah leaves. Because Isaiah writes a lot more about him than this. Isaiah was a prophet alive during his reign. In fact, key events in Isaiah's life, he refers back to Uzziah and events during Uzziah's reign. There is an overlap between the reign of Jotham and Uzziah because of that. And different points in time in history when people were trying to make chronicle, write the chronology of when things were, they would confuse that and try to put, Jotham's reign after the end of Uzziah's 52 years of being king and get things off. And would put the overlap, if they did that, in different lengths and get things off. Modern scholars recognize that there's a little bit of uncertainty because none of the accounts give very accurate distance at times. 2 Kings compares it to the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, and so gives better chronology, but that's in a period of time where there's a bunch of turnover and short reigns and some uncertainty in how long they reigned. So that introduces uncertainty in how when Jotham started reigning versus Uzziah. Verse 22. The other events of Uzziah's reign from beginning to end are recorded by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. Uzziah rested with his fathers and was buried near them in a field for burial that belonged to the kings, for people said he had leprosy, and Jotham his son succeeded him as king. So this account acknowledges that Isaiah the prophet's account gives most of the details. They've taken from the royal treasury, the royal Chronicles, and told details that weren't in Kings. Kings told some details like when he came to reign compared with the Israelite kings, how long, Jotham reigned after the death of certain other Israelite kings, etc., etc. So there's more chronology there, but glosses over a lot of the details about Uzziah. And he just had leprosy and he died. They say he was buried in a field for burying leprous people. Here it says it was a field owned by the kings. So the kings were providing the leprous people a burial ground and basically was doing a public service by making sure that lepers that died didn't just stay out on the surface because nobody wanted to touch them. They had teams that would go out, find the dead leprous people, and bury them to help clean the land and keep leprosy from spreading more. And it was owned by the kings, and he was buried there. So when you put the two accounts together, you see the societal influence there. The King Uzziah, liking the land, liking agriculture, wanted to keep it clean, and so he provided a burial place for lepers and teams that would take the bodies and bury them there. And the people thought that was an appropriate place to bury him since he had leprosy. And it was near the burial place of the kings, but not in it. So he had one sense honor, but another sense less honor than any other king, even the evil kings that came before him. And because he had pride, he was afflicted and lived a very afflicted life. Yeah, it was a long life. 16 when he started reigning and reigned 52 years. He was 68. For that day and time, quite old. But because of his pride, and he tried to be a priest also, God afflicted him, and he was a behind-the-scenes administrator, but not the leader. His son Jotham was the real king and sat on the throne some of the time as regent, and after he died as a king. But the people didn't make that distinction until after the fact. Holy Father, when you bless us, please keep us humble. Uzziah was good for the people, good for the country, as long as he acknowledged you and did things your way. But then when he got prideful, he tried to take things into his own hands. Keep us from having that kind of pride. Have us to continue to do things the way you want us to do them, that we would honor you with our lives and not take things into our own hands, that you would not have to punish us like you did Uzziah. Lord, have us to have the kind of reputation he did among the people, that we would be good for the people that know us, blessing their lives and making our community better because we know you. In your holy name, amen. I am your host, Frank Reich, Associate Pastor of Family and Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church, and this has been the Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, December 10th, 2025. And this was recorded on Saturday, December 6th, 2025. Mother was admitted to the hospital this afternoon, and I went up and spent about 4 hours with her. She is doing better right now than when she was admitted, but her health is very frail. I'm going to ask that y'all pray for her, pray for me. There's a lot of ministry to go on this month. I want to advertise right now the lessons and carols. The choir has been working on it, and I think things are going to be very good. And it is an important set of lessons. Oscar and Bill have been planning this since last Christmas, and I've been overhearing the details all year. And as a choir member, I'm excited to see it come together. It's actually a very good lesson, or sets of lessons, if you want to say it that way. I like what they've done. I love it, and I think the choir is ready already, and we just have to, continue to polish and do our very best for God. So I hope to see you tomorrow at church. I hope to see you Wednesday, and if not, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.